Okay, in this PowerPoint YouTube video, I'm going to try to explain the Paycom expense report process, make it a little bit easier for those of you having trouble. First thing you want to do is go to your Paycom login page and log in. Enter your username, password, and your last four of your social, basically your Paycom credentials, and log into Paycom. When you log in, the first window that pops up has a main menu bar on the left-hand side, and 4 categories down you have a tab, My Expenses. You want to click on that to expand. Once you expand it, you have 4 options: Expense Dashboard, Add Expense, Recurring Expense, and Expense Reports. You're going to want to add expenses. Once you click on Add Expenses, you're going to come up with a window that has several fields that you need to fill out. Fields that are indicated with a asterisk are required fields. Probably the most important field on here is the very bottom one, Expense Report Description. That is not a required field, but is required to submit all your expenses as a report. So keep that in mind. That's probably the single most important field on here. Your first field is expense rule, which is mileage, tools, tolls, any category that you might need to expense. The next field is the option to upload a receipt. You'll upload a receipt for anything except for mileage, because you won't have a receipt for that. The next field is expense date. That is the date that the expense was actually incurred. Expense account, you can ignore that because we don't use that. Expense description is just a brief note on the expense. And the bottom field is expense report description, which I'm going to go over in more detail on the next slide, excuse me. So at the beginning of each pay period, if this is your first expense that you're going to add, you want to go to the bottom and create a new report description. Click on the arrow on the right side of the expense report description box, expand it, and you'll have the option to create a create new report description. You want to make it something relevant to that pay period. For example, WE, week ending 9/23/2017, period ending 9/23. You can make it whatever you want. Just make it relevant to the pay period and something that you'll remember, so you can track these at a later date if you ever needed to go back. When you click Create a New Report Description, this window is going to open up. It's going to have an option to Add New Expense Report Description. In that empty box is where you add the name. And this, for example, I chose to call this expense report period ending 9/23/2017. And then I will click Add Expense Report Description. After you do that, another window will open up asking you to confirm that is what you want to name your expense report. Click OK. And then you'll go back to the actual the expense that you're adding. So on this example, I'm doing mileage. I won't have a receipt to upload, so I'll say the expense date was 9/12. Say 100 miles to my trip to Rehoboth Beach. I left the expense account blank, and then on expense report description, I chose my period ending 9/23/2017. That'll populate because I created that expense report. So for each expense, for this expense period, you'll have that option in the drop-down. So once all my fields are filled in, I want to go to the bottom and submit expense. Now you keep in mind, because you created an expense report, because your bottom field is filled out with the expense report description, this isn't this isn't submitting the expense report to approval. This is submitting the expense report to the expense to the expense report we just created to submit at a later time. So it's going to calculate all of your expenses that you are adding to this report. Once you hit submit expenses, it's going to bring you to this list of expense reports. This can also be accessed with the expense report tab on the main menu, but this is going to show you past reports and their status. For instance, I have several that are already paid, starting back in April 24 at the very bottom, going up to 9/11, which was submitted, not approved yet, and then the current one that I'm working on, it's at the very top, and I have a link on there to review and submit. Because this report, it hasn't been submitted yet, I can go in there and edit it, delete it, whatever I need to do. But this is a handy tool to use. You'll see that was my one expense for $48.65. As I add expenses to this expense report, that total should increase. So you should keep an eye on that as well. So there's a review and submit button that we just talked about. This will submit the expense report for manager's approval. The update button, you can make some changes on this page, but really it's just the date. I think you can add a receipt as well, and then you would hit update and it would change it. And there's a little button on the right top above the approved sign that is for a PDF. You can actually generate a PDF file, which will give you a list of your current expense report. You can use that as a tool to cross-reference, make sure you know everything that you meant to expense for that report has indeed been uploaded, and it's just a handy tool. You can generate a PDF by clicking on that PDF button, and you'll get a file that looks something like this. It'll have, if you have 5 items that you expensed, it'll have 5 items going down. This one only has 1, but there'll be more. You don't need to sign this or submit it. This is just a tool that is in there that I like to use to double check and make sure that I haven't missed anything before I submit my expense report. The expense dashboard will show you every individual expense, even though it is on a report. It'll break everything out according to date. You can actually filter it to do a date range. But I use this if you submitted an expense and you expected it to end up on your expense report and it didn't show up. For instance, your expenses were $50 and then you added a $10 toll, and your expense report still says $50. There's a good chance that you submitted that $10 as an individual expense. You would find that in here. It's going to go according to date. So if you expensed it on 8/31, go down. You can go to the edit button, edit, and most likely you'll see that you didn't include the expense report description. You can fix it there, and it will add it to the report. So this is a brief overview for your final submission of your report. You go to the expense report tab. It'll pull up the expense report screen. You want to review and submit it. If you're confident that everything is right, you've double checked it with your PDF file, then go to the bottom and click submit expense report, and that sends it to your manager for approval. I know this was a pretty dry run, a pretty high level explanation of how to do this, but I hope it makes things a little bit easier.